name's Sam Goodwin, and from 2010 to 2020, in those 10 years, much of which I spent living and working overseas, I was in Singapore for 6 years, in Dubai for a year. I traveled to every country in the world. But like any worthwhile venture or endeavor in life, it wasn't without its challenges. And perhaps most notably, in the spring of 2019, after having been to 180 of 193 countries, I went to Syria, and just 2 hours after arriving, I was walking through a roundabout on the way to meet up with my guide, when all of a sudden a black pickup truck abruptly pulled up next to me. 2 armed men jumped out of the back seat and instructed me to get inside. Thankfully, they weren't violent, but I didn't have a choice. I was scared, confused. I had no information or anyone to help. I was desperately trying to understand what was happening. These men were loyal to the then Syrian president, Bashar al-Assad, and told me that they were skeptical about my travel history and my travel motives. As we sped down back alleys of the city, the officers in the vehicle accused me of espionage, of being an American spy, and collaborating with terrorists. Nothing like this had ever happened to me before. The truck drove just a few minutes, and I was taken into the basement of a facility that I now know is called Syria's Military Intelligence Prison number 215, a facility notoriously known for housing political prisoners. The officer in charge, he spoke a little bit of English, and he escorted me to a cell in the back of the basement. And when he put me in there, he went to the inside of the cell door, and he said, "Food, water, toilet? No. Otherwise, quiet, no talking." And he slammed the door and left. I was stunned and in disbelief about what had happened in just a few short hours. My life had spiraled out of control in the most terrifying of ways. I felt exactly the way they wanted me to. Hopeless, utterly cut off from any control of my life. Thankfully, the cell wasn't too small. I could walk around just a little bit, but it had no window. It was all concrete. I had nothing but a small blanket to lay on the concrete floor as a bed. I remained here in solitary confinement for 27 days. The only human interaction I had was for a few seconds in the morning and evening when the guards brought bread, boiled potatoes, and water. During this time, I was never physically harmed, but the facility was not soundproof, and every day I would hear the sounds of inmates in neighboring cells being beaten and tortured. Of course, I couldn't help but wonder, when's my turn? I realized I was in an environment where nothing was off limits. I never stopped caring about dying or the long list of other bad things I thought might happen, but I began to lose the energy to be afraid. Normal or average prisoners spend their time counting down the days to the end of their sentence, but hostages count up. During this time in that cell, I found strength in several ways. I leaned on perspectives that I developed from traveling to different corners of the world, which provoked gratitude for just the basic food and water I was being given. I leaned on skills and traits I developed from being a competitive athlete: mental toughness, critical thinking, resilience. How often have we had a boss or a coach tell us, control what you can control? I leaned on a belief that I had a purpose in life and a desire to see family and friends again. But most importantly, I leaned on my faith. Everything had been taken from me. My material possessions, my communication, my freedom. But no matter what, I knew that my faith was absolute. My prayers became this uninterrupted conversation with God. I was constantly talking to him, pacing back and forth, kind of like I'm doing right now. Saying things out loud. Even though they told me not to talk, I said, God, I'm here. I'm listening. What are you trying to tell me today? What can I learn today? What are perhaps the positives about my situation today? My number one prayer was always, God, please keep my situation safe and peaceful. Please keep me physically unharmed. My second prayer was then about the timeline. So if this was all going then peacefully, then the next question was, when? And this was the prayer that for me became the most tricky and intense. I remember almost positioning it as like a business deal. I said, God, I know you have a plan, but is it possible? Would you consider an adjustment to the timeline? Can that work with your plan? I then finished all of my prayers by saying the rosary, and I would dedicate each decade to something different. I prayed for my family, my friends, anybody who I thought might be working to get me out of this situation. I prayed for world peace. I prayed very hard for the courage to forgive my captors. And through that, I discovered that I was working to forgive people who weren't even sorry. And that's strength. Forgiveness, I found, is not a feeling, it's a choice. Thanks to the strength that I generated, primarily through my prayers, I made it to day 27. I was taken out of solitary confinement, and over the next 35 days, was moved to a handful of other facilities. But on July 26th, through the intervention of the Lebanese, I was released and driven from Damascus into Beirut, capital city of Lebanon. I was taken to the Office of Lebanese Internal Security, kind of like the equivalent of the FBI here in the U.S. And when I walked into the office, in addition to dozens of government and military, intelligence officials and journalists, my parents were there. Culminating this moment that was indescribably emotional, one that many people thought would never happen, and a breathtaking display of God answering prayers. I had the opportunity there to meet and thank a man named General Abbas Ibrahim, who heads Lebanon's internal security. He had mediated my release with the Syrians. And that's General Ibrahim. The next day, as we made our way back to the U.S., to St. Louis, I learned that General Ibrahim's negotiations had led to President Assad in Syria finally figuring out what had happened and dropping his false charges against me. I became, and I am, the only American civilian that he ever released. So I sometimes will end or wrap up my presentation here, but when I do that, one of the first questions I always get is, so, Sam, how exactly did you get out? Much of what I've told you so far this evening has been the story of one man in a cell. But in truth, there was God's story. I was Assad's hostage, but only until God accomplished what he intended to through my captivity. me quickly tell you just a little bit about what I mean by that. The news of my disappearance was essentially learned through me going dark. I was always very good about keeping in touch, especially if I was in more of an unstable place. And I had communicated that I was going to be there for just a few days. When that time passed and people weren't hearing from me, they began to worry. My father works in civil engineering. My mother is a registered nurse turned educator. Both of them are smart people and have had relative success in their respective professional fields. But they're an average family from St. Louis. They had no idea what to do when their son went missing in the Middle East. But thankfully, they began to act. They reached the FBI field office in St. Louis, which pretty quickly escalated some of the highest levels of the U.S. government in Washington. But throughout my captivity, my family had kind of a roller coaster experience with the U.S. government. But early on, the government communicated two key things to my family. First, they said, we strongly recommend that you keep this out of the news. Keep all of the communication very tight. Don't let the press get a hold of this, because if they do, and Sam's captors, depending on who they are, which was still unknown at the time, feel that type of pressure, they might just kill him. The second thing they said was, you should really manage your expectations. We have no diplomatic or economic ties with Damascus. There may not be a whole lot we can do here to help. 3 weeks later, my younger sister, Stephanie, who was 25 years old at the time, living in Nashville, she particularly became entirely overwhelmed with everything that was happening, and she decided that she needed to call someone and talk to them about this and just blow off some steam, which was against the recommendation of the U.S. government of keeping all of the communication very tight. So she decides that she's going to call her former college roommate, who is coincidentally also named Stephanie. So there's this phone call between the Stephanies, and as the story goes, hey, how you doing? And my Steph says, well, actually, things aren't very good. She goes on to explain, my brother has been missing for weeks. Nobody's heard from him. We're working with all of these agencies and officials. Nobody's been able to help. We're really scared. Roommate Steph is, of course, shocked to hear something like this, but she says all the right things, offers her full support, and at the end of the call, as the story goes, roommate Steph says, hey, if there's anything I can do, just let me know. And my Steph responds almost jokingly or sarcastically. She says, honestly, unless you know someone who knows Assad, the Syrian president, please just pray. And roommate Steph says, wait. Let me call you back. It turns out that roommate Steph is Lebanese. And her uncle is good friends with General Ibrahim. General Ibrahim has a somewhat secret back-channel relationship with the Syrians and was able to mediate my release when so many others were struggling to do anything. When my sister called her college roommate, she didn't really even know that she was Lebanese. She didn't know Lebanon was close to Syria. She couldn't find Lebanon on a map. It wasn't strategic. She was just calling a friend at a time when she desperately needed support. this evening, I believe that if in that moment she would have decided to just call a different friend, I might not be here. So the FBI, the CIA, the White House, the Pentagon, Pope Francis was involved, Russian intelligence, Middle East NGOs, private sector security companies, were all struggling to be effective. But my sister's college roommate could identify a path to get an American hostage released from captivity in the Middle East. So what do all of us here this evening do with a story like this? What's the message? Well, once I wrap up here, I'm happy to answer questions. I'll be around afterwards, but what's the message? I have to say, I'm still processing many of these experiences, and sometimes I feel like the best thing I can offer is to recommend having a resourceful sister, which is important. One of the things that I was most profoundly reminded of through this is the way that God will use ordinary people to do extraordinary things. As he did with my sister, as he's doing with me today as I share this message around the world, and as he can do with all of us in our own personal, professional, and spiritual lives, especially as we support Vera, Aqua, Vita here this evening. I was being held hostage amidst a brutal civil war where war crimes, crimes against humanity were running rampant. The most connected, influential people in the world were working on it, struggling to do anything. And the result that everyone was working towards had never happened before. Doesn't sound very encouraging, does it? But when God was ready to solve this problem, he did so very quickly, very simply, with a phone call between two 25-year-old girls who used to be college roommates. How does that happen? Because it's God's story. Thank you very much.